Hey everybody, welcome to the podcast. My name is Chris,
My name is Amari.
and it's 2024. I think that we all know the world could be a better place, and I also think that we all have a collective choice to make that so. Overall, that's a little absurd. But this show is called This is Absurd, and it's all about talking about absurd problems that need absurd solutions, and we hope to meet people who are doing just that.
Correct. Accurate. People who see where we are on the timeline of being human, and they're like, not good enough. And they come up with ingenious innovations, wonderful breakthroughs in technology, or just cool ideas that take us to where we could be. And here we are, just documenting the process along the way.
Let's make it happen.
Come on in.
All right, everyone. On today's show, we have Dale Wheelahan. He's the CEO of 4-Day Week Global, and we're really fortunate to have you here. And I can't wait to dive into what you're working on and to hear more about that. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Chris and Amari, for having me.
Yeah, totally.
Hell yeah, man.
All right, so could you introduce yourself for us, Dale? Tell us who you are, what you're all about, and how you find yourself as a CEO of 4-Day Week Global.
Yeah, so as you can tell, I'm Irish. So I studied my undergraduate in physiotherapy, or physical therapy as you call it, over in the US. And I've always been really interested in health and well-being of people, and realized pretty early on in my career that I'm not a very good physio. So I said I needed to figure out how to fulfill my passions elsewhere, which brought me to the world of research. And I did a PhD at that point in behavioral science. And I looked at the impact of sleep deprivation on surgeons, which was quite the experience as I worked with surgeons for 3 years. But always really interested in, trying to make a positive impact on the world. And the conversation around working time was happening when I was doing my research. And it was being led out by this organization called 4-Day Week Global. And so eventually a position became available to apply for CEO, and I literally put my name forward. You have to be in it to win it, as they say. And it's been quite a journey over the last year. We have been running trials with academic partners across the world, looking at why working less time is better for not just people's health and well-being, but for business productivity and more broadly on society when it comes to issues of equity, sustainability, and health. So it's been quite a wild ride, but a really enjoyable one.
Dale, I want to know why you said you've always worried about or had concern about like health of people, but why do you really care about this topic? What drives you to really push into this?
Yeah, I mean, I think my own like personal experiences with health and well-being have probably been informed. I originally went into physio because my mum has a healthcare issue that physios would have had a lot of interaction with. So that drew me to wanting to go and work in healthcare originally. But I just realized hospitals weren't my forte. So I needed to figure out how I was going to, impact on the world in a positive way, which is what my undergraduate degree taught me. I was really glad I studied it because I think it gave me a good foundation around what's important in the world. But more broadly, I've experienced burnout myself. I've experienced, crippling stress, and left my PhD with two mental health disorders. Get more than what you bargained for, and I feel
Congrats.
quite deeply about. Thank you. Yeah, it was quite the addition. Um, I've been very concerned about where we're going as a society with regards to our relationship with work and prioritizing all of our efforts in all the wrong places. And I feel we're more disconnected than ever to what's important in life. And I see the world of work as playing a massive role in perpetuating that.
Can I jump in real quick, Chris?
Totally.
So I would assume you're the expert to ask this question, Dale. So I think a lot of this show is about questioning the unquestionable, or questioning the things that seem like standard. Like we're kind of born into a world, and there's some things that just don't get questioned, right? And I think one of the things that don't get questioned is that, yeah, you work 5 days a week, but nobody ever asks, like, where did that come from? It feels like an arbitrary number. So I'm curious if you, as the CEO of, a company that's trying to undo that unquestioned standard, where did that idea come from? Why do people work 5 days a week in general?
I feel like you're opening a Pandora's box by asking me this question because my entire
Yep.
PhD was on fatigue and burnout. Uh, so what's really interesting, if you want to, really understand this, we need to go back as far as like the 1700s and 1800s. And
Oh,
the
wow.
concept of people and their relationship with work was very different. You think about society back then, we were a largely agrarian society. People worked 7 days a week. They worked the land. They produced the amount of crop that was required to sustain themselves and their own family. And for
Mm,
many, that was a sense of balance. Yes, there was poverty, and yes, there was those sort of things, but issues of burnout and exhaustion, those sort of terms didn't really exist, and stress didn't really exist within the phenomenology within literature at the time. When we started to
yeah.
see the concept of fatigue and burnout emerge within medical diagnoses was actually on the turn of the Industrial Revolution. So it was when we started to have much more organized work. So people were taken from agrarian work into cities, and houses were built close to factories, and they worked these people to the bone, essentially. And it was really, the foundation of capitalism with regards to let's get the most out of people and produce more and more and more. And that's really where, these topics of stress and burnout, other diseases at the time called neurasthenia, started to be, diagnosed by clinicians. We also saw other emerging trends like the emergence of Protestantism within society, and how the Protestant work ethic versus the Catholic work ethic was actually this whole thing back at the time. Protestants were seen to work hard in service of their, spiritual needs, and that became very embedded within some societies, which created this idea that one must always be working and must always be doing something in order to be a good, purposeful person in society, which contrasted actually to pre that theocracy form where the idea of idleness was actually rewarded. So the upper classes really rewarded spending time in nature, thinking and reflecting on things. But all of those sort of things were basically quashed with the Industrial Revolution and the rise in the influence of churches. You then had the 5 day work week was birthed actually from the 6 day work week. So you had people working 6 days in factories. They spent their seventh day going out to some really nice, sunside or seaside resort. Many of our cities still have them in close proximity. And but what they were finding was that 6 days was still exhausting people a lot. And the 5 day week was birthed not because of the health and well-being of people, but because fatigue was causing much more error on service lines. So people were dying, people were losing arms because they were so exhausted. And so that is where business leaders said this is costing more than it's worth. So they brought in lower working hours. Alongside that, you had many other movements like the trade union movement and all these other sort of voices making the case for a 5 day week as well. We're now 100 years on from the Industrial Revolution. We don't work by and large, particularly in developed nations, in industrial type settings. Work is a lot more cognitive and emotional now than physical. And when you look at any of the science, humans are not able to concentrate or maintain that level of cognition to the same extent as their physical muscles might have been able to sustain on a service line back in the 1900s. And it's really that mismarriage between what type of work we do, the parts of ourselves that we use in engaging with that work, and the amount of working time that we do that has created these issues of stress and burnout in our workforce.
Okay, that just opened up, you're right, Pandora's box, because now I have 76 more questions. Um,
No more do.
so thank you for that. So I'm going to repeat back some of what I'm hearing, and I'm going to toss in some questions at the same time. So what I'm hearing is that originally there was no concept of a work week. It was just like you wake up and you work. That like that was life. 7 days a week, right?
Correct.
And what I'm also hearing is that when it was 7 days a week, it was because that's what you needed to do in order to survive, right? Like we have to toe the land in order to harvest this amount of crops so that we can be able to eat tonight, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then what I'm hearing you say is that eventually we went to like a 6 day work week. And right around the Industrial Revolution, we went to 5. and 5 was because we were seeing that there was like diminishing returns on the amount of work that was created versus the amount of people who are losing limbs. And eventually somebody was like, all right, we should probably, our workers need limbs in order to get some of this stuff done.
It's good business to have limbs.
Yeah, you would think, right? Well, not now because
Yeah,
now we're all cognitive. So technically we don't need the limbs, but that's a side conversation.
absolutely. But back in those days, it definitely was.
So what I'm hearing is originally in the Industrial Revolution, we were like, okay, what is the maximum amount of work we can put in for the maximum amount of return, right? And it was like, because we were mainly using our muscles or our bodies, it was like, okay, what's the most output that we can get from our bodies before, again, diminishing returns. But now what
Yeah.
you're saying is that because there's like a cognitive switch and now it's less about using your body, now it's about using your mind. What I'm hearing is that there hasn't been enough of a conversation around like at what point do you get diminishing returns with the mind? And it's just like, after 30 hours a week that you put in, eventually you don't lose a limb anymore, but maybe you have a breakdown, maybe you have a panic attack. Am I tracking that correctly?
Yeah, you are. And, actually what the research says is that we only get about 2.5 to 3 hours of optimal attention in any given day. So really, if you were to try to get the highest return of investment, you'd only have people working 3 hours a day probably. But that's obviously not how our world of work is organized. So we need to look at how do we need to account for some of those diminishing returns because they are still important in our world of work. And that's where the idea of reduced working hours in a form of a 4 day week or versions of a 4 day week is the nice, solution in today's increasingly complex marketplace. Um, you also look at the relationship between worker happiness and working hours. So people actually get happiness out of work, and that is what research shows us. But actually, people only require about 8 to 10 hours of work a week to actually get maximal happiness. Anything after that, it kind of plateaus until about the 28 to 30 hour mark, and then it starts to go down. So the longer people work, the more unhappy they tend to get. So you're trying to marry these different findings and trying to find the sweet spot of what might be, optimal working hours in, a palatable market.
Copy. So, and I'll toss it back to you in a second, Chris. I just want to grill Dale for a second. So, just to pressure test this a little bit, I think that it makes sense to say, like, all right, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to be a CEO and look down at your assembly line and be like, okay, well, 80% of my workers only have half a hand. It's like, I should probably adjust this, right? But now it seems like the effects are kind of invisible, right? Like you can't measure how many limbs have been lost this week on the assembly line. So I think, is that why it's more difficult to maybe convince a CEO to move to a 4 day work week because they can't necessarily see the detriment and the cause, the negative effects that a 5 day work week is having?
Yeah, it's a really excellent observation. So, in the cognitive world of work that we are in, we don't know what good looks like because we've never defined it. And it's
Yeah.
interchanging now with technology. And so, productivity has skyrocketed with the implementation of technology. And so, therefore, we don't actually know what good in humans look like. So, that's one of the first things we do with organizations when they come to us. We ask them, well, their concern is productivity will go down. And we say, well, what is productivity for you? How do you define that? How do you evaluate it? And you will quickly find that they say, well, it depends on how many hours people put into their work. And we know there's not a relationship between time on task and good quality output work. That it's just been irrefuted several times over. So we know that business leaders actually really struggle with this concept in the first place. Where I think the conversation has gone over the last few years is that we are starting to see some metrics that are important for CEOs, and they're things like struggling to recruit, struggling to retain, and higher levels of absenteeism, higher levels of presenteeism. These are the metrics now that are costing businesses a lot more because they are rising over the last few years because people are more burned out and stressed out. So while we might not be able to directly, in many instances, see how many toothbrushes we make on a service line, we are able to get an idea of whether interventions are working based off some of these more business level metrics.
what would you have to say about like if you're an assembly line and you lose an arm? I'm just stuck on this idea. It's like because the fact that we let people lose arms is just wild, but that's absurd. But 100 years ago, when somebody lost an arm, it's that's hard to replace, right? But now, I think as a CEO, it's like, okay, cool, you're burnt out. Like, just take a day off, and it's easier to replace you. Therefore, addressing the core root of the problem might not be as motivating, right? Because it's just like it's harder. It's seemingly harder to replace a limb than it is to get somebody back from burnout. Does that make sense?
So actually recovering from burnout is extremely complex. So I think there is an overuse of burnout actually within like organizations. Burnout is very much an end stage state of chronic stress. People cannot operate when they are experiencing burnout. And when people do experience it, they have to take months off work in order to recover. So it does end up costing organizations quite a lot of money if they end up getting their staff to that point. But more importantly, in the knowledge industry now, as it becomes more complex, skills and capabilities are becoming really key assets for business. So people want to retain really good talent because it costs so much money to bring new people in and to get them up to speed and to make sure that they align to your strategy and all of that sort of stuff, particularly in senior management roles or middle management roles. So there's huge risk in actually burning out your staff at those levels. It's going to cost you huge amounts in institutional knowledge loss in your business, longer term, which is what many businesses are struggling with now.
What would you say to somebody who's like, all right, I'll take care of my middle management, upper management, but my lower level employees, like, they're replaceable. I'm not worried about their burnout because I don't have to retrain somebody else.
I mean, look, that's what a lot of CEOs in this world do. It's how a lot of the business models in organizations work. Um, Two things, I suppose. First of all, these people who are maybe in the lower tiers of your organization, if there is a promotion structure, so I'm thinking a traditional consulting firm, for example, you want to actually keep those people in because they understand the business, so they rise through the ranks and they can continue, building the business. Whereas if you get external people coming in, it takes them a lot longer to do. And that's where you find in some of these larger organizations, they put their staff through a baptism of fire earlier on in their career and hope that they survive. But increasingly, Gen Z are just not doing that anymore. They're saying, screw this, I'm going somewhere else and I'm getting paid better. And that is now putting a lot of these organizations in very precarious positions because they are realizing, oh God, we're going to really struggle to have a funnel of new like people wanting to work for us because suddenly our reputation is going to be we're not a nice employer to work for. So there has been a shift in the market balance between the towards the employee over the last few years, which I think is hugely beneficial. Secondly, though, it's just not good for business to burn out your staff. That's increasingly what we find. If you want your non-management staff to work well, it's in your interest to have them not be stressed out and figure out how to motivate them. And that is the science that we're trying to prove to organizations.
Cool. Chris?
Some funny things have happened since you guys have been talking. How I'm like jotting down certain things, and you just kind of are covering them in your own ways and by the path of like the logic of this.
That's absurd.
That's absurd. But like off the bat, you were talking about stress as if it was like losing an arm. That's what I encapsulated. And no one even said anyone's losing an arm yet, but I wrote down losing an arm. Just I think that there's like a disconnect between stress and mental load and emotional load is as powerful as losing an arm. And I think that maybe part of your job is like solidifying that for people, like letting them know that, because to my ears, like objectively, it wasn't lining up at the front of the podcast. Like, so stress, like there's no like key words like demonstrating the weight of what stress could be for people. And are you doing anything in your work to like move out of the numbers, like the business numbers, and like get like a visceral kind of presentation to people? Is there anything like that happening?
Yeah, I mean, what I think you're touching on, Chris, is a broader societal issue that we don't place parity between physical and mental health. So, you know, when people see a physical illness like cancer or, heart disease, people tend to get a lot of sympathy for those sort of things. Whereas when someone says that they're experiencing an anxiety disorder or they're depressed, people just say, well, go outside and touch the grass and look up at the sky and you'll be fine. There's a huge disconnect and we have a huge amount to go as a society with regards to understanding the evidence-based interventions that improve people's mental health and placing parity between those two different things and realizing that they both have negative impacts on people's performance and their ability to function in society. What we're really interested in doing is showcasing the broader implications of reduced working time, not just on people's productivity, not just on business, but on creating a new type of society. So I always ask the question to leaders, would you like to work a 4 day week? And by and large, everyone would say, yeah, it would be great to work less. I don't have enough time as it is. It would be great to have more time. And what I say is, it's not that we don't have enough time, it's that we just don't use our current time effectively. So we have decided to create this structure for ourselves. So therefore, we can also decide to change it. And we are afforded the opportunity now more than ever with the likes of AI, which can reduce some of that workload for us to actually create a new type of world of work for ourselves. And our research shows that when people work less, they report lower levels of stress, they increase their physical activity, they increase their levels of sleep, they have lower levels of work family conflict, they commute less, they use more public forms of transport. So there's larger ripple effects when organizations change how they work on populations. And that is the narrative that we're starting to push now is they say like money can't buy time, but what if it can? What if we could um, change how we work and therefore change society?
Yeah, it's such a powerful space to get into. Well, my question is, do you see this venture as a great fulcrum or a great place in which to start chipping away at creating a better society?
Yeah, totally. Like we spend about a third of our lives in work. So, of course, that's going to have a positive or negative impact on how we create a society around us. Um, we also now live in a hyper connected and digitalized workplace. So the idea of work life segregation no longer exists. So how we work influences our lives and how our lives influence how we work. So the opportunity exists for us now to define what that future looks like. And all metrics are heading the wrong way with regards to further inequities within society, a rising climate crisis, all of these things that are caused by behaviors of people. And if we don't figure out how we can change people's behavior to become more sustainable, to create greater equity, to become healthier, then all these trends are going to get worse. But people can't change their behaviors if they don't have the time to do so. So when you're stressed and you're tired and you're exhausted, you will always do the selfish thing. You will always use private forms of transport to get where you want. You will sit home in the evening and watch TV instead of going for a run. You will not help out your partner looking after your kids because you're too exhausted. You won't show up for your family or friends because you don't have the emotional capacity to do so. So there is a bigger narrative here that we have become slaves to our work, and that is not the way that we should have created this workplace for ourselves. We look at the days past of the Industrial Revolution and we think, amazing, look how much we've advanced since those days. But in fact, what we have done instead is actually create a mini industrial revolution in our own homes because it's not that factories are built beside homes anymore so that business owners have, close proximity to their workers. We now have our workplaces in our sitting rooms. All of us here today are working in, our back gardens, our kitchens, and it becomes much more difficult for us to segregate that work-life balance now. And mandating organizations mandating and giving people permission to work less is a key step in making that, greater balance in the future.
Cool. So it feels like
Well, that's what
the
I
whole
think anyway.
conversation. It feels like the conversation keeps coming back down to, Mr. Monopoly, Daddy Big Bucks, the CEO who's, either deciding that we're going to stay on the assembly line or we're not. And just to steel man the argument real quick, he's the guy who's running the company and his top priority is money, right? So if you're basically telling him, all right, well, 20% of your 20% of the time that was going into your company is now going to be taken away, right? Out of a 5-day work week, now we're going to take away one. So 20% of the time is going to be taken away. How do you convince him that that will not kill his bottom line by at least
Yeah.
20%?
Yeah, great question. So when we do this, we look at the conversation of the risk of not doing something like this. So we look at overhead costs for some of these large organizations that have significantly increased over the last few years. And they are things like absenteeism and sick leave and the cost of recruiting talent, the cost of retaining talent. We know a 4-day week policy basically helps to mitigate those costs significantly from the get-go. So already you're cost saving in some areas, which is another lens to look at this from. The other point then is to say, you as a CEO are interested in how do you make people in your workforce work more efficiently. So you use methodologies like Lean Six Sigma, you encourage your workers to be agile, to be flexible. But what you aren't considering is that humans are not machines. So we can't simply, turn a little, nodule and expect a significant improvement in output by 20%. Humans are fueled by motivation. So if I'm a highly motivated worker, I'm going to give a lot of energy and engagement to my work. Whereas if I'm lowly motivated, it doesn't matter how much you tell me I must work harder, I'm not going to. And that is where CEOs miss out. The world of work has fundamentally shifted since the pandemic. So workers have collectively woken up, I would think, and they realize that I don't have to put up with poor working conditions anymore. That's something now that workers for the first time have said to themselves because they saw what the alternative looks like when they had better work-life balance. And in doing so, motivation becomes one of these key interventions for leaders to figure out, how do I motivate my workforce? And you motivate your workforce through 3 different things. You make them feel like they're doing a good job. You make them feel connected to people and to your purpose. And you give them more autonomy over how they do their work or their own lives. A 4-day week helps to achieve those 3 things. And therefore, you can get a higher level of motivation, get higher levels of engagement, get higher levels of productivity and efficiency within your workforce. But by undermining those 3 areas, you're constantly undermining motivation. You're constantly going to get lower standards of performance. And maybe you're okay with that, but fortune favors the brave is what we would say. All data and trends are showcasing to us that there is a better way to work. So it's on you as a business leader to decide whether you want to take that risk and innovate, or whether you want to continue with this paradigm of work, which is becoming increasingly outdated. I would say that we see more and more business leaders becoming interested in the topic because there is a new wave of workers entering the world of work who are changing everything. And that is Gen Z, who are just throwing the rule book out the window. They don't want to work 9 to 5, 5 days a week, and they refuse to do so. And no matter how much Gen X and boomers say this is how things must be done, it's not going to be that way in the future. And workforces rely on young labor to survive. So it's in the interests financially of these businesses to figure out, how do I engage my younger generation of workers? Because I must keep them in order to sustain my business. And if I don't, I'm going to have higher overhead costs for recruitment and retention.
So what I'm hearing you say is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing is showing to Daddy Big Bucks, Mr. Monopoly, that, his prime motivation is he wants output. He wants top output, right? But you want to show him that output is correlated to motivation, not necessarily to time spent. So what you want to do is maximize for motivation, not necessarily maximize for amount of time in the office.
Yeah,
Is that right?
it's a really nice way of summarizing it. And we don't neglect productivity, by the way. So the foundation of our organization actually is from two founders, Andrew and Charlotte, who are business owners in New Zealand who trialed it on their own company. And we use what's called the 100-80-100 principle that we founded. So it's 100% pay for 80% time for 100% output. So when organizations actually engage in trials with us, they are constantly evaluating productivity or output as one of the three pillars of the trial. So we want to be able to showcase that you can work less but maintain performance standards. And we've worked with over 350 companies to date. 92% of them have continued on at the 6 month mark. So there is obviously something working for these businesses.
Not to throw an entire wrench in your plans, but I think it's kind of my job on the show.
Try me.
I hear you. I see what you're saying. You say, all right, look, let's do a 4 day week work week instead of the 5 day. What if we threw all that out the window and we said, look, every single worker in the world gets paid based on the amount of output that they create. It's basically like a commission based workplace instead of right now it's like a time based workplace, right? So every single person had metrics through which that they were measured, and from those metrics, that's what they were paid. Do you think that if we went with that system, that people would still overwork themselves to death? Because the thought is like, why would anybody push themselves right now, right? Like somebody who knows that their mental health might be suffering, they're still going to push through because there is something that they're trying to get on the other side of it, whether it's recognition or maybe potential commission pay. So would you be willing to drop the 4 day work week and do the do the fully commission based work week instead?
I think it's a really interesting perspective. I think it all depends on what people value. So in the past, people have valued money above all else. And money has been seen as the savior of all woes. And yet, despite a lot of research out there showing us at this point that it's about the 70,000 US dollar mark, though probably now with inflation a bit higher. That's actually the peak amount of salary that seems to create the most happiness within people. And thereafter that, people tend to not be as happy, whether it's on the lower pay scale because of issues of job security or not being able to finance oneself, or higher levels, usually more money means more problems. So there is a need to recognize that. And I think we're seeing more and more people not looking and chasing for higher salaries because they know it means, more stress and more work. You will always
Yeah.
have a population of people out there who want to work long hours. And I'm not going to say those people shouldn't be allowed to function within society. Um, but by and large, we shouldn't be rewarding that because if we want to have any hope of creating a more balanced society, we can't be financially rewarding the wrong type of behaviors. If we're going to incentivize better balance, better output, then we need to do so understanding the science, the physiology, and the psychology of human behavior. You can't work yourself into high productivity. You need to be smart about it. I always like to use the analogy of high performance industries. So, sport, aviation, nuclear energy, they all recognize the risk of fatigue and sleep deprivation and stress as impacting negatively on performance. And what
Right.
we're essentially trying to do is take those principles and put them into the worker and say, you want a high performance worker, rest plus stress equals recovery, not just stress.
I think it's a really interesting way of framing it. I think when you put it in the athletic or aviation, it seems pretty obvious. Like, yes, people can't work a 72-hour shift.
Mm.
What do you think, Dr. Lukides?
I think you guys are both doing a really good job at answering questions and asking questions.
Let me pose it to you. What would you
Yeah.
think? What would be the implications of rewarding people purely based off that output commission based model?
Can I answer like half baked first? But I'm interested in what Amari says too.
Go for it.
It was a good question. I just ran it like I'm not a super AI computer to run the simulation of it, but if I were to like run a brief concept of it, it would kind of, people would fall where they want to. They would go down the path they value, and there would be people who work a ton and burn out, and there would be people who don't. And hopefully there's a good middle ground where people find a balance that is generated by something more than themselves and their own values and more of a communal value. But yeah, it could be pretty chaotic to do that in a lot of ways, but that's about as far as I've like clicked into that.
I mean, we're kind of going that way though in some degrees with the gig economy. So,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yes.
we already know the risks associated with the gig economy and how it creates more precarious working conditions for people, how it can take labor away from other places, how it can create inequities within the workforce. Certain people are going to be more able to do the gig economy than others. So if we're hoping to try create a society, for example, that has more equity, um, we know that men traditionally have more free time than women. That's just how stats show us. And so we would simply be reinforcing that stereotype that men can succeed by dedicating more time to their work, while, women who are continuously evaluated by time instead of output will always lose out in that sort of equation. That's not just my hypothesis. Research shows that like part-time working models, 80% women take them. And when
Hmm.
women tend to be evaluated based on output, they tend to be rewarded similar levels of remuneration to their male colleagues. But when they're rewarded based off time, that's where the gender pay gap helps to emerge within workplaces.
Mm-hmm. It's probably a thing in which needs to be determined case by case, industry to industry, organization to organization. Like there needs to be a set of scaffolding to help coerce the effects of things in the right direction. That is special to every niche, maybe. So it's quite a complex kind of thing. But
Absolutely.
yeah, what was the question for Amari? Like, what would happen in
In the commission economy?
the purely
Yeah.
commission chaos storm that it.
Yeah. Well, I love chaos. So let's start there. Um, yeah, it's almost like occupational anarchy. It's kind of cool. I do think that, to be serious for like 4 seconds, I do think that it would create a lot of disparity. And disparity, like it would create a lot of polarity, right? Like you would see people on one end of the spectrum who are like, oh, how much time and effort I put in is directly correlated to how much I'm gonna make. Like I'm gonna like spend every waking minute of my life working on something, right? And some people, like you say, who are like, I'm just gonna do the bare minimum to get the bare minimum. And so I think you would really, more than anything, I think it would be a cool social experiment, because I think you would really get to see who people are in a way. Because I think that, yes, there's a conversation about like motivating people, and how do you motivate people? Is it through purpose? Is it through connection? Is it through money? And I do think that there's something to be said for like, there's a conversation to be had for like people's just innate motivation. Like I do think that some people are just innately less motivated than others, and there are going to be, the David Goggins of the world, like hustle, grind, and in the commission economy, they would be the billionaires, right? Because they're innately already wired in that way. So I think that's as a social experiment, I think it would just be very interesting to see the way that people find themselves on either end of the spectrum. I do think that it would create more I mean, we already kind of have like a large gap between the rich and the poor, but I think it would create an even larger and more distinct gap. And I think, inherently that would create more polarization between people as well.
It could unlock
Yeah,
more
definitely.
old-timey survival things, though. I don't know. We're going way hypothetical. I want to redirect questions, but just to close out the hypothetical, from my own mind, is it could unlock more societal, like large family dynamics, where like the motivated people are hunting and gathering for everyone, and then there's like more like grandmother relationships and things. Like I don't like who knows,
Oh,
like
that's such a romantic and kumbaya vow. I was
yeah.
like,
I
that's
mean,
not going to happen.
it could be that way. I think that happens when there's struggle and hardship. When the components are available to a society, I think.
You think the highly motivated would go out, do the stuff, make the money,
Well,
and then
some
bring it
people
back to the less motivated?
not. It's not a universal across the board statement, but it'd be like, I mean, a lot of people. I don't know what was it. I think some old interview from the '80s, Mr. T, what had like all like gold from top to bottom, and his shoes were like duct taped together, and he's like, the interviewer was like hating on his shoes, and he's like, well, those shoes are to remind me where I come from, and that's like the neighborhood I come from, and I go back to support my neighborhood with all the things that I accomplish. So
But
there are
everything
people
else is
that do
covered in
that.
gold.
It's
Yeah.
more of like he shot at his shoes with remembrance of what's important to him and his where he comes from. But
Yeah.
I
It is
have a
romantic.
question. Maybe I'd love to take the interview this direction, which so far the interview's been super fun to hear and just super great. Here's where I want to go. I want to ask, what kind of a society would make you think, yes, this is the right direction for people? What kind of markers or events would be coming? And it doesn't have to be 4-day work week, but it can be. Like what markers and events, like we see it and would make you feel, Dale, like that's the right direction. Like this is exciting and this is healthy for us. Anything comes to you?
Yeah, yeah, great question. So I think it's ultimately sustainability in its broadest definition. So um, the ability of people to sustain themselves within their own careers so that they are able to go in, do meaningful and purposeful work and feel engaged and happy in that work, and connect with colleagues and not have to compromise their health and well-being in the name of their work. And have good relationships with colleagues as a result of a high, positive culture within workplaces. Businesses focusing their efforts on realizing the responsibility that they have on society. So actually having like very wealthy organizations being more responsible with regards to their climate targets, with regards to their equity, policies, and getting rid essentially of this like marketing that we see so much within businesses that claim they're one thing when in fact they're practicing other things. So having a greater level of transparency and honesty within leadership in businesses, which I think would create a better ripple effect than in society where we would have a, a lower level of hostility towards one another. So we're increasingly polarized as a society, the US more so than most countries at the moment. But we need to realize that, if we want to create greater harmony in society, we need to realize what we have in common versus more than what we have, as difference with one another. And I think we achieve that through creating better levels of community within, our local areas, within our areas of common interest. And we do that by affording people more time as an enabler of that. So when you are down at your local shop on Friday and you're being pleasant with, the person who's serving you coffee, and there is a community reading club happening that you had the time now to join, and you therefore get to meet all these other people that you never would have experienced before. So you can create a greater level of, connectivity within your local communities. I think that would be a really nice metric of it as well. I think people having, sufficient time and sufficient money to be able to pursue their own personal passions and interests I think a world that has less technology is actually a world that's probably better. So we need to reclaim our attention and get rid of the TikTok rot that has taken over many of our brains.
Mhm.
And that means retraining ourselves actually to reconnect with the world around us and find purpose and meaning in the more simple things in life, like how amazing it is that things can just grow around us in nature and we are engaged in this massive system, and we're but a speck in it all. So I think there's something around people, people's ability to look beyond their own self-interests would be a really nice reflection of society. Um, so they're just more broader general definitions. I don't know if you're looking for something a bit more specific. Are you looking for a CEO productivity sheet from me, or I don't know if I can give that to you right now.
No, it was just like those are great answers. I have high demands for my question maybe in the back of my mind, but I'm also what I mean by that is looking for those like science fiction events where it's like, fuck, this is a new community in the fucking Amazon. That, but that's what I hope for the world, and I was just wondering if you had any ideas like that.
Okay, well, if you were looking at behaviors, then you would have greater levels of physical activity in people. So people not using transport as much, using their legs more. We become a highly inactive society. You would have lower levels of obesity within society as a result of that, which would create much lower levels of chronic disease prevalence across, you know, the society as well. We know that exercise is it's the single closest thing that we can have as a magic pill for health. So no matter what meds we take, actually exercise can have a positive impact on so many physical and mental health conditions. So actually, it's in all of our interests to figure out how do we make people more physically active. Um, Same with sleep, people actually getting higher levels of sleep. So getting between those 7 to 8 hours of sleep, people eating more high quality and non-processed foods and getting the right sort of nutrients. Um, we would have more levels of public transport. We would have lower levels of carbon emissions within our cities. We would have greater parity in childcare between men and women. We would have greater equity between protected characteristics within workplaces and their rewards. We would have a greater or lower level of poverty within areas, urban areas in particular. They're the sort of metrics that I think would reflect a society going in a much better way.
Nice. Um, to stay on this thread, I have two-part question. How does your organization that you lead influence other companies to go in that positive societal direction? But also, like, what parts are outside of your scope, and who might pick them up? It's more of a personal community need, and like, what in the world could help us there? You think outside of, I don't know, it's a big thing.
Yeah, so I tend to be quite a pessimist, really, but I've been constantly surprised by the pace of change of which this conversation has grown over the last year. So I'm quite hopeful actually as to what can be achieved over the next few years in this space. I think our scope of work is showcasing that by creating sustainable well-being in your people, you can create sustainable performance in people, which can create a sustainable business, which can help create a more sustainable world. That's the narrative and the equation that I'm trying to prove over the next few years. So we obviously have a greater sphere of influence over businesses and the people within businesses, but it's not neglecting our responsibility actually in showcasing the policymakers and the very influential people within our world that changing how we work will actually help change our society. And so we don't neglect any of those areas of responsibility. It just tends to be that we're more focused on the world of work, and that's what our bread and butter is. We've seen more and more that businesses who engage in these trials realize that they're tapping into something much bigger than just reducing working hours. They're changing the leadership of the world of work. towards a one that realizes I don't have to burn out my workforce in order to sustain my business. I can both sustain my business and have a sustainable workforce. And they're creating that ripple effect then, I think, across the world, which is quite powerful in today's society.
I have like some highlighted questions, but I want to pass it to Marty to see what has bubbled up for you, like in the feelings department, as you hear any
Bubbled up in the feelings department. It was a great way to posit that question. So this might seem tangential, but you bring up this point earlier, Dale. You were talking about AI, or not technically AI, but you're talking about technology, and you're like, oh, I actually do think like turning the dial down on technology would be good. And I agree with you on that. And the concept I've been playing around with lately is this idea of just because we can doesn't mean we should. Because I think, for example, it's like the nuclear bomb. It's like, I think we can, but it's like, should we? I don't know if that's the best idea.
Yeah.
And with AI, everybody's
Yeah.
so, not everybody, but a lot of people are afraid. But yet we continue to persist in building it. So this constant question of just because we as human beings are capable of something doesn't mean we should. And when it comes to this whole work week situation, I've noticed for myself personally, there's times where I'm like, oh, well, I can put in another hour, right? I can push myself to do this next project. And maybe it does bring me in more money or whatever, the company more money, but should I? And I think that there's, I'm not sure if it's a statement or a question, but there is this idea of like, well, even if working a 5-day work week did bring you in more money, like even if they, looked at all your research and they're like, Dale's a fraud, we're going to have $7 more if we, if we push everybody to the point of burnout this year. And we really want those $7. I do think it's like, well, even if you can, should you? And so I do think that there is a conversation to be had of even if somebody disagrees with you, that you maximize profit by reducing work. It's like, what if we had a bigger conversation around like, well, is maximizing profit actually always the end goal? And should it be the end goal, even if you can? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a much bigger question for businesses to have now, and one
Yeah.
that they can't really ignore to the same degree because there is these global challenges now that this maximize profits endeavor has actually contributed quite significantly to. So the
Right.
climate crisis, the rising mental health crisis, the inequities within our world have been caused by businesses that have put profit above all else.
Right.
And we have seen, we look from about the 1980s onwards with Reagan and Thatcher's, political agenda towards freeing up businesses and not reducing, legislative power on businesses. This is we're reaping the crops of that sort of policy now, and we're reaching the end stage of it, I would say. It might have created huge benefits earlier on, this neoliberalism, but it is now starting to cause more problems than it's worth, in my opinion.
Right.
And the problem is that the generations that have created this are now exiting the world of work. And they're actually exiting with pension schemes. They're exiting with benefits. Whereas it's the emerging generations, it's the millennials and the Gen Z that will be left with these global challenges, the need to change business while also dealing with the repercussions of that profit above all else philosophy. And I think it's why ethical leadership as a concept has become more and more prevalent in the last few years. Just because you can doesn't mean you shouldn't. Doesn't mean you should.
Right.
But it's a very hard case to build. That's very hard, for CEOs to take legitimately. And I think it's social pressure is going to be the thing that's going to make it happen. It's accountability on places like social media. It's accountability in collective action. It's those sort of trends that will force leaders to change their behaviors because they'll realize I'm actually going to lose out more money by not changing my agenda
Yeah.
than if I keep it, in its current way.
Do you, if you were dictator of the world, dictator Dale, right? And we imagine that previously, before this moment, what the world was optimizing for was profit, like you say, like profit above all else. This is what we need. Bottom line, what is the highest dollar that we can come away with? If you were a dictator Dale, what would you want us as a society and as a civilization to optimize for? What should be the top priority?
Happiness.
How do you measure happiness?
Good question. Mainly, it tends to be life satisfaction, tends to be the most reliable marker of happiness. And there's a lot of research out there in the well-being economic space where we invest our money and what level do we create happiness for a certain cohort, or do we create happiness for, larger cohorts in society? And if we were doing so, we're designing policies that are actually going to bring, developing countries up, and investing less in developed countries. And that's the sort of, you know, it'd be require a fundamental shift in the very privileged position that all of us are in. Let's be real, we benefit significantly from being on top. And if you were to create a society that was more equitable and healthy and, sustainable, it would have to require a fundamental shift in the power balance between developed and developing countries. And yeah, a significant reallocation of resources, I would think.
Cool.
But that's a tough sell.
Well,
It require all of us to have a very deep reflection.
I think that if you're a dictator, you don't have to really sell anything. It's kind of just mandated. But go ahead, Chris.
I suppose, yeah, you kind of just you get to do whatever you want. Yeah.
Exactly.
But a dictator with a heart is maybe in the hardest position someone might be able to be in.
That sounds like a really nice book, actually. That's a really nice book title.
The Dale story.
But as I listen to you too, I feel that this emphasis on profit, well, Dale, your emphasis on sustainability, like profit's not available to an organization that isn't sustainable. So I think that is a good thread to like have people focus on it. But obviously there's kind of talk about the older generations like kind of have a different view of sustainability, and they're like scratching with their nails to like hold on to the old way, and like they're trying to be sustainable for the old way, but there's a new sustainability that I hope kind of wins out. And it maybe it has to, just because of generational shift. But for a question, I want to ask Dale, are there any, so there's all this resistance to like a 4-day work week, and I even think we could do 3-day work weeks or something like that.
Don't
2-day
push
work
it.
weeks. Personally, I think like there should be like every day is for something else, and we could get away with like 2 days of work. But
Wow, you're from
the question I have, are there any? So there's this resistance to shift to a 4-day work week. Are there any big dominoes that are sticky but are going to fall soon that you might see like into the 4-day work week kind of camp? Anything happening right now?
So I would say how this movement has grown might be a nice way to answer your question, is that when I was speaking to organizations 2 or 3 years ago, I remember speaking at a small event in a chamber of commerce, and that being told at the time, this will never work, full stop. And what 4-day week global has been doing is trialing this with organizations across the world. And we have academics who independently evaluate outcomes. So Boston College, Cambridge University, Stellenbosch, Münster, loads of different universities. And they've been the ones producing the data to show, yeah, this actually does seem to work within organizations. So they have been critical in actually building the business case for this. They have then created a huge media storm. So 2 or 3 years ago, like the articles written about a 4 day week, it went like this to like this in like 12 months. And that has created a societal conversation around a 4 day week that we now kind of think, oh, a 4 day week, that's not that, you know, bad of an idea. 2 or 3 years ago, if you saw that article, you would have thought it was an absolute batshit idea. So that's how normalizing this conversation has created, this trend. The collective masses then in non-management are starting to pose questions to management saying, what we really like actually is a 4 day week. You keep on asking us how you can improve our well-being. Here's how we would like to do it. That means management are then coming to us saying, look, our staff want us to do this. We are losing our staff left, right, and center. Maybe we're going to experiment with something like this. Then they do the 6 month pilot. They realize, oh, there is benefits with this, and they continue on with the pilot. You have a large financial services firm does it. That creates competition then within the sector for talent. So another financial services firm says, we must now implement a 4 day week. And therefore you create a storm norm within an industry. And then that creates the front runner effect within another industry because they want to be the first out the blocks. And that's the way we have seen this movement grow away from just small and medium enterprises to larger businesses embarking on what is a large transformational change for their organizations. Lastly, then, we have had legislators catching wind of this and saying, I want to be the politician who talks about bringing in a 4 day week because selfishly, I'm probably going to get a lot of attention for making that case. And secondly, I can make this a very significant talking point or define it as my political, legacy. And that means that you have legislative changes happening in the US or proposals like Congressman Mark Takano's bill in California, Bernie Sanders' bill in the Senate. You have a Scottish public sector trial ongoing, a Belgian sponsored, government sponsored trial, Portuguese sponsored trial. So you're creating this relevance from the public sector and from government as well. And suddenly it becomes this unignorable and naturalized conversation around what the future of work is going to look like. Very similar to how we talked about flexible and hybrid working 4 or 5 years ago. Before the pandemic, we were saying to ourselves, we could never have people working virtually. We don't trust them, it'll never work. We proved it can work, and it has now become the norm for many organizations. You are now seeing some businesses are trying to reverse that trend with return to office mandates. And all research is pointing that that intervention is not working. People are leaving organizations that are forcing them to return to office 5 days a week. And even when they do it, productivity is not improving when people are back in the office. So the tide has changed essentially. And it's only going to get stronger, I feel.
Yeah. I like what you're saying. I think you have some good Kool-Aid
Good.
if anyone out there in the listeners want to drink it.
Were you
like
seeing me drink my Kool-Aid there for the last hour?
a little bit, but also I think
Look, I
yeah,
understand what I say is hugely aspirational and like comes a bit sales pitchy, but the
it's good
reality
Kool-Aid.
is that yeah, it's good Kool-Aid. We all want it. But my experiences are have been shaped by my own like life experiences. I've worked in the public sector in a system that was on its knees and struggling with staff levels of burnout. I worked in academia, which was a similar issue. I worked in the world of corporate, where people were burning out for a different reason. They might have had better benefits, all those sort of things, but they still had no purpose in their work. And now I get to work for this organization that is trying to create a better world of work, but not doing so out of the blue, but following an evidence base. I'm an
Mhm.
academic at heart, and I want to create objective, real knowledge in the world that's going to make a real impact. And so that's really what drives me in this work is that I wouldn't be doing this if I thought I was a complete con
Mhm.
in it. I do think that this is a really worthwhile endeavor for us as a society to start to embark on, thinking how we approach work and how much work we do and the impact that that will have on making better business and making better societies. And ultimately we all want this and we have the opportunity to create it. We just have to be smart about it.
Mhm. Yeah, I was gonna continue to say, like, just any listeners, I encourage them, say they work at Google or something, go reach out to your company and see what could come of it. Or maybe they work for a city agency or something, like, who knows? But I think it is good stuff for the right people or the right managers or the right VPs to go to your company. I think that it could be some really interesting moves.
Well, here's two questions for people to reflect on if they're still not convinced. Give me evidence as to why the 5-day week in today's society. If you don't think the 4-day week, tell me why the 5-day week.
Yeah.
And show me the evidence that shows high burnout equals higher productivity. I'm happy to be convinced.
Yeah.
Secondly, if we are going to reward people based off time, if that's the philosophy that management are going to, pin their flags to the masses, then let's start paying people for overtime. Let's not just pay people for 40 hours of work, but actually give them 50 hours of workload and not remunerate them for that. If we're really being deliberate about what we're evaluating, then, create work that's only 40 hours of work. Don't create work that's 50 hours of work and only pay for 40. They're the sort of reflections for people to take away.
I love that. Should have started with that.
No, it goes back to a question I didn't get to ask, but I want to now. There were factors that you discussed about that generated the 5-day work week idea. What factors should we consider when we set our new duration of work, regardless of how long it is? You've probably talked about these factors, but how do you express them in this angle?
As in, what are the trends that will drive us towards a 4-day week, is it?
Considering they brought down the work week to 5 because people were losing their arms. Just starting from scratch, what factors should dictate how long we work for in a week? Like, what should we look for?
Well, to use your analogy, we have the 5-day week because people were losing their arms. Let's have the 4-day week so people aren't losing their minds. And I think that is, to summarize it all, we need to look at this. Work is more cognitive, so let's start looking at people's brains. Let's start understanding how people are performing with their cognition. Let's understand how people's emotional experiences are in workplaces. And if they're not optimal, then the world of work is not working for us. And that's where we need to start understanding the relationship between working time and attention, cognition, vigilance, emotions, all of these different things that we know make good work or equally make bad work.
Yeah, maybe all of these very human things will be so valuable in the future because machines will be taking the rest of the work. And it's like if you were to bottle up these things that only humans could do, that's high value stuff and needs to be taken care of and kind of treated sacredly and nurtured, I think. And you could spend a lot of... Yeah.
People always ask me the question around AI and the 4-day week. And the way I see it is, first of all, there's huge fear. AI is going to take all our jobs. And like technology, that was the fear in the early 2000s. We get to determine whether that plays out or not. So we either get to create a new economy or we get to sacrifice careers in the name of AI. I am hopeful that we are going to create new jobs or create different types of work, but we can't neglect the fact that there is going to be competition with AI with regards to the type of work that exists within our world. So highly repetitive, laborsome, menial work, humans can't be doing that in the future because business leaders are not going to invest in a human resource to do that when AI can do it in a significantly lower amount of time. That's just basic business. So therefore, what can humans do that AI can't do? And it's like you said, Chris, humans can understand the human experience. They can innovate, they can create, they can collaborate in a way that they understand the real world through the lived experience. And that's the space in which human capability in the future of AI needs to start building on, is what new capabilities around innovation and creativity do we need to start teaching people to access in themselves. But we cannot access those skills if people are stressed and burned out in the first place. When we're tired and exhausted, we go into automatic, repetitive ways doing menial, laborsome work. We don't use it to create our best ideas. So if we want to create differentiation in the world of work in the future, we need more rest in our people.
Here's a good question. I hope. Hope it doesn't cause any friction back at the office. But do you have any ambitious ideas for the 4-day work week potential that get pushed back, maybe internally at your company, or just in general, like with people? Do you have any like ambitious out there, like what if we did this, and you just have a hard time getting footing for that idea?
Well, look, one thing perhaps we didn't mention is that a 4-day week implementation is challenging. So it is not an easy intervention. It's not the reduction in working hours alone that brings about these benefits. It's the transformation that organizations have to undergo to actually implement it successfully. So that means in 4-day week global, we're a team of 12 people across 5 continents working with 20 partners and 30 academics. So we have a pretty complex system. We also get media across the world that hawking us on trying to understand what the next bit of fine research we're doing. So we do feel that pressure quite often. Um, so we have to be super deliberate as a team around what version of 4-day week we're implementing in order to cater to what is forthcoming for our business. And we have those challenges around funding and the sustainability of the business and growing the business and keeping people happy and healthy. So that creates natural tensions all the time within the business. And I suppose my learning as a leader of a 4-day week organization has been that tension is healthy actually, because if we had it all right, then I knew we wouldn't actually be growing either. So a high level of safety psychologically exists within our team where people can push back and say, Dale, stop giving me more work. Like I'm up to my ears. And I say, that's totally fine. Let's deprioritize that work. So we have a very live conversation on a near day-to-day basis of like what needs to be prioritized and what doesn't need to be prioritized. And that means that we do spend a lot more time on that, but we still get the same level of output. But I'm a hugely ambitious person. I want to create a million new years of free time. And uh, it's taken a while for our organization to set itself up to how we're going to achieve that. But open communication, dialogue, trust with one another, and realize that we're all trying to achieve the same thing means that all of those tensions are healthy tensions, thankfully. Touch wood for now.
Nice. Yeah. Um, we'll have to end in a matter of minutes for the schedule, but Amari, is there anything that would be regrettable if we weren't to ask it?
So much pressure, damn. Um, I'm really enjoying the idea of we initially had to change so people didn't lose their limbs, and now we're changing so people don't lose their minds. I think if you haven't already coined that phrase, you should coin it. It's good.
And actually, I'm like, I just need to copyright that. I'm like writing it down here.
Yeah. Make sure I take some credit for that. I'll take halfway responsibility.
Is there any great stuff that people are doing with their free time? With this million years of free time?
What I love actually is we look at what people do in their time off, and people don't take up new jobs. People aren't engaging in the gig economy as much as people might have thought. They are taking up a new hobby. They are like engaging in volunteering in their local communities. They're finding more time to have with their kids, with their grandparents or their parents or elderly parents. These are all hugely important parts of the human condition that we have lost so much over the last few years. And one thing I'm quite passionate about is actually understanding the science behind human connection and how much human connection is actually important for our, longevity. Research from Harvard shows that the single most predictor of long-term health and happiness is good quality human connection. And I think if we're open and honest with each other in society, we don't have a lot of that right now. And that's because we are placing all of our emphasis and priority in all the wrong places. what gives me huge hope is that by freeing up time for people, they tend to gravitate towards achieving those greater levels of higher connection with themselves and with the people that are important to them.
Yeah, Dale, thanks so much for being on the podcast. We hope to hear more about your organization.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much for having me on the show, and I look forward to seeing where these conversations go over the next few years.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll catch you
Thanks,
next
Dale.
time.
Peace, y'all.
Bye, everybody. See ya.
Peace.